Very much indeed. Okay, well, we've got the main themes out of the study now, and I'm going to pass straight on to Caroline, who's going to give us some of her reflections on this, and then straight over to Duncan, and so we have enough time for you all to be able to engage as well. Caroline.
Thanks. Well, I found this a really engaging book. It's very rich. It has a very rich text, and it draws in a very broad literature. So it's quite compelling, and I read it thinking that I understood it and I empathised with it. And it was great, once again, to find a book with a naturally high profile because it's from the bank, but talking about individual empowerment, talking about power to, power with, power over, and talking about listening to people. A chapter on personal agency, stating emphatically the centrality of psychological dimensions. And all of this is very familiar to people who've worked on participatory programs, even if many of those programs are sadly and alarmingly not necessarily producing the results they should. But it also talks about the centrality of families, the power of unity, and at the same time the tensions of gender and power relations. So it felt like a book with a good perspective, and for me that was partly because it was alluding to something very close to my own reference point for understanding development, a book that refers to personal power, to families, to gender, to collective action. It's talking about social relations. And I should say that I'm an anthropologist, and I see the world in part through a social relations lens. So this book did seem to touch all the right buttons for me. But as I went deeper into it, I found more to critically engage with. So before I describe a couple of issues that I have with the book, let me say that I was a co-author on the Chronic Poverty Report. And I do understand that it's not easy to deal with data sets of this size. It's a major task. There's a multitude of issues in books like this. And you have to make difficult choices about what is more or most important from a huge array of potential issues that are thrown up. Creating order out of that sort of complexity is a very challenging task. But this book does that. You may not agree with its conclusions, but it does make a case, and it's built on very good empirical data. The book talks importantly about poverty dynamics, and that's something that is absolutely central to our report on chronic poverty. And there are many reasons which I think were explained why poverty dynamics are very important, and it's also extremely good to see this brought, much more into the forefront of debate. It's not enough to understand that people are poor, but the fact that they're moving through poverty, and that really affects the sort of policy you might think about. It also demonstrates that poverty is not an identity but a situation, and reinforces what we know to be true, that people are not poor because they're lazy or feckless, and that is the most commonly held perception universally of why people are poor. So it's not due to their personal characteristics, but it's because of their personal situation, and a situation they can and do leave. There is movement out of poverty. So I really want to focus on two main things. Firstly, the way in which social relations are so central to this book, but I feel at the same time they're also quite partial to the book. And secondly, some observations in relation to the Chronic Poverty Report, which is remarkably similar to what's in the bank book. So let me start with a point about methodology. These are very experienced researchers, and they've considered the problems inherent in the methodology very carefully. And they devote a lot of time to explaining this, the problems of subjectivity, bias in recall, social context, power structures. But I don't think some implications of the bias are necessarily dealt with. The self-identified causes of poverty and routes out of poverty make much of initiative and opportunity, which I think is correct, but very little of discrimination and structural oppression. It's noticeable in the pie charts. There's not a pie segment which says, my route out of poverty was overcoming caste or gender discrimination. Now, of course, we don't actually speak in those terms, and we don't necessarily think in those terms. But there was nothing that really related to my husband, my religion, my caste won't let me go to market, get an education, use birth control, educate my daughter, and so on. Now, there's all sorts of reasons for not articulating changes in those areas. Who's present in the room when you're talking, suspicion, fear. And the researchers also noted that. But it's also because norms which are oppressive can be difficult to articulate and explain, especially when they both enable and disable the individual, norms such as patronage, or some would say norms such as marriage. So the ability of the poor or any of us to define problems in a structural way is important, but it's also very limited, and we're all limited in that. Social norms are all-encompassing, and they control how we think about the world we live in. So, by and large, in the development community, we're so used to our world travel, to stepping in and out of different communities. We forget how useful a heuristic tool that is for us to think about who we are and the way we live. We're aware of ourselves in relation to others. We're enabled by stepping out of our own communities and seeing our own lives better. For some, that route to self-knowledge is explicit. They understand the process. For others, it's just implicit. But if you never step out of your social norm, how can you know how your life is shaped, how it may be different? So I do have concerns about allowing self-definition to so drive the methodology and indeed the conclusions, and I think it does drive the conclusions. And I disagree that the individual is the expert on their own life, although I absolutely understand the intention of this sentence, with so many development experts rushing around the world telling people what to do. But outside of this, each individual does need a wider reference to understand and change their life. So the methodology in the book as a whole is conscious of social relations, but at this grassroots level, ultimately, it has to abandon its potential influence in defining poverty. Nevertheless, the structural dimensions of poverty emerge again and again and again in each chapter. At the centre of social relations is the issue of power, and I felt the book in a way engaged with it but also skirted it. It doesn't really engage with power struggles within the household and between the sexes or between classes. The gender dimensions of poverty, I don't think are that strongly covered. That is acknowledged again and again and again throughout the book. There are many references to women's oppression, but I didn't sort of follow the storyline through that as to where that was going. I think one of the reasons it's difficult to integrate is because the social analysis in particular is kept at the local level. I got the sense that to some extent the political analysis was at the meso level and sometimes the economic analysis went to the macro level, but the social analysis was kept local. And there's a strength in this in many ways. It's immensely influential for poor people. But overcoming oppressive power relations requires going beyond the local into deeper society-wide social and structural causes, and those are articulated also at the macro level. So when I see a chapter entitled Equal Opportunity, I know that it can be about not being bribed, having access to credit, and I don't think it's just my cultural bias to want to see something in the conclusions beyond economic opportunities that refers not just to access to power lines or electricity, but access to power in its relational and political sense. And it felt, to an extent, that gender concerns, social stratification, issues of power were battling to get into the conclusions, to cross over that finishing line and get into the conclusions section of each chapter. But they kept being beaten back by the dominance of what I thought were more economic concerns. So social relations are held out tantalizingly, but not, I felt, brought to their right conclusion. And maybe we can discuss this a bit more later, why this is. But let me also say something else about writing about these issues. When we wrote the Chronic Poverty Report, there was one chapter that just kept getting passed backwards and forwards between people. And it was the chapter that was about social inequality. And it was a very, very difficult one to write. And it wasn't because we weren't convinced that it was central. We were very convinced about that. But what do you do about social inequality? It's very difficult, and it's very difficult to link it up to policy. But what we do know, and what history tells us, is that change can and does happen, and that we have to engage with that. So the second thing I wanted to talk about was this comparison between the two books. And it's not that much longer. In the Chronic Poverty Report, we estimated about 1.2 billion people in absolute poverty and 443 million trapped in chronic poverty, so poverty with duration. And we identified 5 factors that trap the chronically poor in poverty. And many of those correspond to the themes in this book: insecurity of assets and income, limited citizenship, lack of voice and participation, spatial disadvantage, being in remote areas with poor infrastructure, social discrimination, gender, race or caste, and low economic opportunities. These are dominant themes in this book, although naturally there's with a voices focus, there's much more illumination around the experiences of poverty than we were able to put into our report. But I feel that our emphasis are arguably reversed in the conclusions, where the Chronic Poverty Report makes much of anti-discrimination legislation action for empowerment, and collective action, I felt these faded away in this bank report, or the bank book, where democracy, markets, and individual opportunities hold sway. Now, when you're writing reports like this and books, you're always under pressure to identify the 3 things that will make a difference. And the reality, of course, is that we need to engage at multiple levels in any form of development. But those 3 which we ultimately choose, I think, does reflect a wider worldview. So for the chronic poverty team, our conclusions, and actually we couldn't get them down to 3, we ended up with 5, were around anti-discrimination and gender empowerment, social protection, public services for the hard to reach, building individual and collective action, however difficult that might be, and attention to urbanisation and migration. Our conclusions didn't go back to growth whilst acknowledging it to be absolutely necessary, or even democracy. We shied away from that. We noted that many non-democratic countries had high levels of human development, and we focused instead on social justice. But I felt our conclusions were focused on the very same priority themes that come out of this book. I felt the conclusions in this book went back to democracy, market, and individual opportunities. And it unconvincingly, I felt, played down safety nets and public services in the conclusion section. And that belied much of the content. The attention to social stratification can't be overcome just by allowing individuals opportunities, and a whole chapter devoted to collective action, but a conclusion focused on the individual. It didn't quite ring true. Yep. But I felt that if your conclusion is informed primarily by the voices you've listened to, and their definition of poverty is a definition which cannot, because of the reasons I talked about earlier, step out of social norms and include structural inequality, then this naturally won't feature in your conclusions. So I think it's a problem that the book has to struggle with. But I also think it's a very important book, and the depth of information is a treasure, and it will be an influential book. And it has many and considerable truths in there about the reality of lives lived in poverty. And that is something that has to underpin all development action, but is all too often forgotten. So it will change the way we act on poverty if we actually focus on the content. It's a very good book.
Thank you very much.